I don't think anybody's questioning the quality of your work. I'm not an attorney. I've never argued a case before the Supreme Court. I'm not a prosecutor or solicitor general. I'm a business person, so I've been trying to figure out how the average citizen would look at this hearing and try and understand what we're trying to get to here. You've mentioned once or twice that it gets a bit when people ask you about political motivation, when it has to do with the renewal request for the FISA warrants, you've said it gets a bit murky. And I just decided, being somebody who used to do a lot of organization charts, that I'd try and explain to the American people why this gets a little bit murky. I'm going to focus mainly on the DOJ chart. This is roughly the organization structure that was in place with the DOJ. Before I do, let's get some of the characters who were not on the DOJ org chart, although very actively involved with those who were. So I want to get this right. This started with a dossier that was paid for to be prepared by Fusion GPS by the DNC. And Steele was a part of that process. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then his primary subsource was someone who, when he was finally questioned, said they misstated or exaggerated our statements, that the alleged sexual activities were rumor or speculation, that the conversations were had with friends over beers and so on and so forth. So that was something after the dossier was used as a basis for moving forward with it. This is information that came afterwards that was known to people in this organization chart before they attested to a FISA court that the FBI found the Russian-based subsource to be truthful and cooperative. That's an accurate statement, but if they had included all the truthful and cooperative comments that he made, it would seem to me that that may have had a different effect on the renewal. It seems to me. Mm-hmm. And the omission of something as profound as this, to not infer from that there was a political motivation, or let's take politics out and say an agenda. This is something we want to get renewed. We want to continue the investigation. I don't understand as a non-attorney how that doesn't carry a fair amount of weight. Now I want to get to this organization chart. So here you can't see it, but it's on record with the DOJ. So I have Orr up here, who reports into the office of the DAG. Mm-hmm. When Steele was no longer allowed to speak with the FBI because he was shopping the dossier, I guess, to make money through the media or for whatever reason, then the FBI just conveniently accepted Orr's feedback from Steele. Now, Steele is somebody who worked for Fusion GPS on behalf of the DNC to get the dossier, which has now been largely proven false. His wife actually worked for GPS, not necessarily when the investigation was going on, but you could reasonably assume that she had relationships there. But when they cut off Steele as a source of information for the FBI, did I hear you right that multiple times the FBI seemed to warmly receive feedback from Steele through Orr?
We identified 13 occasions.
And so this guy on the org chart that's up here working for the Deputy Attorney General never communicated with any of his staff or any of his superiors that he was doing this.
That's correct.
Probably because if he asked for approval, he wouldn't have gotten...
That's essentially what he said.
So he wanted to apologize instead of ask for approval. Now I want to go to this part of the order. What the American people need to know is these aren't people that aren't walking down the hallway and in the meeting with the director of the FBI. I mean, Lisa Page right here is on this org chart. She's a special counsel to Andy McCabe. As a matter of fact, it looks like Strzok and Page were in the office in roughly the time frame. This is something that's very important. This is somebody here on the org chart, somebody that works for the director of the FBI, who says he's not ever going to be president, right? This other guy on the org chart, who you'll see in a future text message, talks about a meeting with McCabe, says, no, he won't, we will stop him. And then he goes on to say, I want to believe the path that you threw out for consideration in Andy, McCabe's office, that there's no way he gets elected. But I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event that you die before you're 40. These are all people that are walking the hallways involved in this investigation, having those sorts of discussions about the President of the United States, or the candidate, and then the President of the United States. Is that one of the reasons why you're being fair-minded and saying it's murky as to whether or not there was a political motivation behind some of these behaviors and the false premise for the renewals of the FISA warrants?
No, the concern grows out of the fact that all of the failures in the information that should have been given and wasn't given, and the question being, what was the intent? What was their intention, their motivation there? And what we determined was we couldn't definitively say what the motivation was.
Are these pretty smart people? Fairly well educated? At least well educated. I don't know if they're smart.
I assume so.
I don't think they were
on
very
that.
smart, to be honest with you.
I was going to say, yeah,
They have law degrees, right? So you think
at least some of them do.
So you think the Woods Review for people at this level of the organization
To be clear, the stuff that didn't happen on the Woods Review was basic stuff.
Yeah.
You didn't need to be a deeply experienced FBI agent to be able to do it the right way.
Well, that's my point. So wouldn't you think that that would almost be muscle memory for people who are going through this process to know that they had an obligation to go through that?
They clearly should have.
And so wouldn't it also seem reasonable that if they didn't, you can't answer this question, but to me, it seems like if something is as standard as that process before you go to a FISA court, to not do it was something that they intended not to do. They didn't want to go through it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems to be a logical conclusion. And then you ask yourself why? Well, because we don't ever want this guy to get elected president. And if he does, it sounds like they want to impeach him. I mean, I can't understand anybody working in this organization understanding the scrutiny that we placed under the FISA courts. And by the way, Mike Lee, count me in. Because we've now seen the abuses you've warned us about. You can smirk again because you were right. But, I mean, it just seems to me that this organization, this closely held organization of highly educated, highly experienced people, I have to believe that they were handpicked for this process. They were picked because they had some of the best reputations in there. They had to know that this was going to come to this, that it was going to be scrutinized, regardless of who the subject of the investigation was. If the names were changed and the parties were changed, we'd still be here. And it looks like they were trying to skate along the edges and get away with something to me. And I can't imagine that they did it for any other reason than a political motivation. And I don't expect you to respond to that because you're doing a great job of holding to the scope of your report. But nobody can tell me, with people of this caliber, with the record of partisan, vitriolic profanity about this president, to say, whoops, we just forgot to do a standard procedural review that you would probably expect one of their staff 2 or 3 levels down to know that you need to do it. It doesn't make sense to me. Now, I want to ask you another question. You've gotten a lot of questions today that had nothing to do with your report. And I think you've done a very good job of saying, I'm here to talk about my report. You didn't do a Russia collusion investigation, did you?
We did not.
You didn't re-prosecute the special counsel report, did you?
Not.
Would you agree that you got a lot of questions today that had nothing to do with what you were here to talk about today?
I certainly had several.
Yeah. So I also wonder whether or not that was politically motivated. Let's focus on this. What I found interesting was that we do have people who are using this as a platform on the other side of the aisle that says, well, now we need to revise we need to look at the FISA process. I don't know why you'd use this as a platform to do that unless you thought that this is a clear case of where the FISA process was abused. And then if you look at this information, this ecosystem of smart people who I think turned a blind eye to damning evidence to serve as a basis for renewal of the FISA reports, it's just beyond my comprehension. The weight of this evidence in your report, I think, is pretty strong. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when we take up impeachment next month, have that same standard for the weight of evidence that we're going to be asked to look at. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Rono.
Thank you. You identify significant issues with the